Title: Paul's Christian Theology, the Fundamental Elements of God's Grace and Faith. Abstract: This paper explores the relationship between God's grace and faith, focusing on Paul's importance in Christian theology and his theological teachings. Paul argued that salvation by God's grace and the acceptance of faith are at the core of Christianity. This paper provides a detailed analysis of the concepts of God's grace and faith and their relationship based on Paul's teachings. Keywords: Paul, Christianity, theology, God's grace, faith. 1. Introduction. 1.1 Background of Paul's Christian theology. Paul is an important figure in the New Testament and a major influence in Christian theology. He left behind letters and biographical writings that form the foundation for Christian doctrine and missionary work. This section examines the background of Paul's Christian theology. Specifically, we will mention Paul's educational background, his experience as a Pharisee, and his revelation at Damascus. 1.2 Research purpose and methodology. The research objective of this thesis is to clarify the relationship between God's grace and faith in Paul's Christian theology. It will clarify what Paul's teaching on God's grace and faith was and what impact this teaching had on Christianity. In addition, this study will employ a methodology that combines the methods of literature study and biblical interpretation to analyze Paul's letters and related biblical passages in order to understand Paul's teachings. 2. Paul's understanding of God's grace. 2.1 Definition and characteristics of God's grace. Paul defined God's grace as God's unmerited love and grace toward man. God's grace is presented to restore man's relationship with God, which has been severed by sin, and is the fundamental source of salvation. Paul emphasized that God's grace is not based on human effort or good works, but rather is a gift from God. 2.2 Origin of Paul's teaching of divine grace. Paul's teaching of God's grace is based on his own faith experience and the revelation of Christ. Paul has his own experience of being saved by the grace of Christ through his own past experience as a persecutor. Paul also understood the importance of God's grace from the teachings of the Old Testament and of Jesus Christ. 2.3 Relationship between God's grace and the problem of sin. Paul examined the problem of sin in depth, arguing that it is impossible for man to be saved through self-effort or obedience to the law. Man's relationship with God is severed by sin, and he cannot restore this relationship by his own efforts. Therefore, Paul taught that faith in God's grace is the only way to salvation. 3. Paul's understanding of faith. 3.1 Concept and definition of faith. Paul defined faith as having a trusting and obedient heart toward God. Faith is an attitude of trust and response to Christ and is the means by which man accepts God's grace. Paul viewed faith not as a personal human effort or act, but as something bestowed by God. 3.2 Faith in the law. Paul taught that salvation by obedience to the law is impossible, but rather requires acceptance of God's grace through faith. The law is a mirror of man's sin, and complete observance of the law is impossible by relying on one's own strength. Therefore, Paul taught that it is important to transcend the law by faith and access God's grace. 3.3 Relationship between faith and salvation. Paul taught that one can be saved only by faith. Man cannot be saved by his own efforts or good works, but rather must accept God's grace through faith. Paul placed faith as the only means to salvation and insisted that faith in Christ's death and resurrection is indispensable for personal salvation. 4. The relationship between God's grace and faith. 4.1 Interdependence of divine grace and faith. Paul's teaching of divine grace and faith are interdependent. God's grace is an unconditional gift to man, which man can accept by faith. Faith, on the other hand, is the way to accept God's grace, and by faith man can partake of the benefits of God's grace. 4.2 Acceptance of God's grace by faith. Paul taught that acceptance of God's grace by faith is the way to salvation. Man is saved not by relying on his own strength or good works, but by accepting God's grace through faith. Through this acceptance, man can experience forgiveness of sins and reconciliation with God and gain new life. 4.3 Response to God's grace and good works. Those saved by faith are expected to do good works in response to God's love and grace. Faith brings about an inner transformation and is the source of good deeds. However, good works are not a condition for earning salvation, rather, they are the result of faith. Good deeds should be part of gratitude and response to God's grace. 5. Influence and importance of Paul's theology. 5.1 Universality of Paul's teaching. Paul's teaching of God's grace and faith is widely accepted as a universal principle of Christianity. Its teachings occupy an important place not only in the salvation of individuals, but also in the community of the Church and in the Christian system of doctrine. Paul's teachings are deeply understood and studied by many believers and scholars because they are fundamental to core Christian doctrines and missionary work. 5.2 Implications for contemporary Christian theology. Paul's teaching on God's grace and faith has had an important influence on contemporary Christian theology. Paul's teachings have been the subject of discussion and study on many topics, including issues of faith and works, the grounds and process of salvation, and the universality of God's grace. Paul's theology has also been interpreted and applied by theologians of different sects and denominations, contributing to the theological development of various denominations. 5.3 Applications and challenges of Paul's theology. While Paul's theology offers eternal hope and guidance in the life of faith, challenges also exist in its interpretation and application. For example, different interpretations and understandings of various topics, such as the relationship between God's grace and good works and the role of the law, exist and are the subject of debate. In the application of Pauline theology, consideration of contextual and cultural factors is important and requires a balanced understanding. 6. Conclusion. 6.1 Reaffirming the importance of the connection between God's grace and faith. Throughout this thesis, the importance of the relationship between God's grace and faith in Paul's Christian theology has become clear. Paul asserted that salvation by God's grace and acceptance by faith are at the core of Christianity. The way to salvation is for man to accept God's grace through faith, rather than relying on his own strength or good works. Reaffirming the importance of this connection is essential in the Christian life of faith and in missionary work. 6.2 Significance of Paul's Christian theology and prospects for the future. Paul's Christian theology has been deeply understood by many believers and scholars through his letters and teachings, and has greatly influenced Christian doctrine and practice. His teaching on God's grace and faith has deepened our understanding of salvation and the community of the Church, and has provided guidelines for believers to do good works in response to God's grace. Looking to the future, Paul's Christian theology will continue to play an important role. An understanding of the relationship between God's grace and faith is essential in Christian evangelism, missionary work, and the life of faith. Moreover, Paul's teachings are applicable in contemporary contexts and have value in faith communities in different cultures and societies. Looking to the future, it is important to further study Paul's Christian theology and address its applications and challenges. Various challenges exist, such as the diversity of interpretations and the consideration of cultural factors in the understanding of God's grace and faith. In addition, promoting Christian religious dialogue and understanding through Paul's teachings is an important challenge. In conclusion, the relationship between God's grace and faith in Paul's Christian theology is and will continue to be a central principle in Christian doctrine and faith life. Paul's teachings offer eternal hope and guidance for Christian believers. References. Dunn, J.D.G., 2009. The Theology of Paul the Apostle. Stendhal, K., 1963. Paul Among Jews and Gentiles and Other Essays. Wright, N.T., 2013. Paul and the Faithfulness of God.